In part 8 of my 10-part series on the date of the Exodus, I proposed that the Exodus took place around 1400 BC in conjunction with the Septuagint's reading of 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 1, approximately 440 years prior to Solomon's construction of the first temple. This makes my proposal one that favors an early date for the Exodus, though not the traditional early date of 1446 BC. In conjunction, I proposed that the Pharaoh of the Exodus was either Thutmose IV if the body of the Pharaoh was recovered from the sea crossing, or a ruling intermediary during the early adolescent years of Amenhotep III's reign if the Pharaoh's body was lost. My justification for this position was that the circumstances in and around Egypt in the wake of Thutmose IV's reign accord well with what we would expect in Egypt after the Exodus, a prolonged period of economic and military weakness. In the last couple of months, I've been getting a lot more traffic on this video, as well as many comments defending the idea that Amenhotep II is the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Upon investigating where this traffic was coming from, I found these two videos were the major sources. Both promote Amenhotep II as the Pharaoh of the Exodus, as well as the traditional 1446 BC date. In this video, I want to offer a response to some of the claims made in defense of Amenhotep II's candidacy as the Pharaoh of the Exodus. The first video was produced by Joel Kramer of Expedition Bible. At the time of my production, his video has over 600,000 views. The second was produced by the Armstrong Institute of Biblical Archaeology, and currently has over 150,000 views. The arguments given in each video to propose Amenhotep II are similar and are based upon the same fundamental claims, so I will be interacting with both simultaneously in my response here. Kramer opens his video with the following statement.
If you just follow what the Bible says, if you just follow the evidence, then the answer to this question is actually straightforward and clear.
He further elaborates on what he believes the biblical testimony is regarding the date of the Exodus.
The biblical date of the Exodus, which is found in 1 Kings 6:1. So there's 480 years between these two events, when the Israelites came out of Egypt, the Exodus, and the 4th year of Solomon's reign. It's very well established that the 4th year of Solomon's reign is 966 BC. So to get the date of the Exodus, all we have to do is add 480 years to 966 BC, and we get 1446 BC, which is the biblical date of the Exodus.
This perspective is echoed in the Armstrong Institute's video.
1 Kings 6 verse 1, which talk about Solomon building the temple, universally recognized as during the 10th century BCE, nearly universally recognized as being 967 BCE specifically. We've got an article about that on the website for people who are interested. So that verse says that the Exodus happened 480 years, or in the 480th year before that. So extrapolating back nearly 5 centuries takes us back to an Exodus quite clearly within the middle part of the 15th century BCE.
Herein we run into my first point of contention. 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 1 is a textual variant. In other words, there are multiple readings of this verse preserved in the textual transmission of the Old Testament down through history. The source of the, quote, 480 years that is preserved in your modern Bible is the Masoretic text, the oldest surviving complete textual witness of the Old Testament in the Hebrew language. The form of this text we possess dates from roughly 1000 AD, though it has origins going back to the early centuries after Christ's appearing. It was preserved by a collection of scribes called the Masoretes. These scribes are also credited with giving us the Hebraic vowel signs that we use to read Hebrew today. The reason the Masoretic text is the text used to translate into English is because it is the oldest text we have that accounts for the entirety of the Old Testament in its original language. However, there is another reading of this verse preserved in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, commonly referred to as the Septuagint, or the LXX for short. The Septuagint, or the Greek Old Testament's translation, dates from roughly 250 BC in Alexandria, Egypt. This text represents the oldest translation of the Old Testament. Its composition of the Old Testament canonical books is also in the same order as your English Bible, Genesis through Malachi. This is also the form of the Old Testament cited by the New Testament authors, and that which would have been most used in the early church. In the Septuagint, 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 1 does not say 480 years. Instead, it says 440 years. If we are to regard these numbers in a strict, literal sense, then the Masoretic text would be pointing to 1446 BC, while the Septuagint would be pointing to 1406 BC. We do not have enough textual evidence to determine which reading is more likely to be original. Thus, we cannot simply consider a single date as the, quote, biblical date of the Exodus, unquote. For reasons I do not know, neither video makes mention of this. I want to assume that this is an honest oversight. Nonetheless, the consequence is that viewers are being misled with regards to the Bible's testimony. To further compound this issue, 1 Kings chapter 6 is a temple dedication text. In the ancient context of late Bronze Age cultures, these types of texts do not contain literal chronological numbers. They are either rounded, for convenience, or idealized, for politics or theology. Thus, it's likely that neither 480 nor 440 are exact dates. I have proposed in my own work on the date of the Exodus that this number, in its original form, whichever one it was, is a rounded figure, not an exact one. This means that we are not left with looking at a single date, but instead a date range, one which spans the time between the variant readings, as well as any spillover in the event that these are rounded numbers. I have proposed that instead of looking strictly at 1446 BC, it is more appropriate to look at the range of 1450 to 1400 BC as a whole, with possible consideration to 1460 to 1390 BC as an extreme extension, in light of the possibility of 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 1 containing a rounded number. Kramer and the Armstrong Institute, under the assumption that 480 is the correct reading and that it is to be interpreted as an exact number, then propose that Amenhotep II is the reigning pharaoh in Egypt in the year 1446 BC.
Amenhotep II reigned from 1450 to 1423, and so the biblical date of 1446 BC for the Exodus falls within the reign of Amenhotep II.
Pharaoh Amenhotep II. And so he is the one I identify in this article as the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Again, fitting with the high chronology, his reign dates to the middle part of the 15th century BCE for about a 26-year period.
When we consider the totality of the biblical witness, however, instead of looking at a single pharaoh, we have to consider all of the pharaohs who reigned during the suggested date range in question. In my estimation, 1450 to 1400 BC. By most Egyptian chronologies, this date range encompasses the reigns of three pharaohs, Thutmose III, Amenhotep II, and Thutmose IV. If we are to regard the extremes of a round reading of 1 Kings 6:1, then we should also consider the pharaohs who bookend these three, Hatshepsut and Amenhotep III. The other issue to keep in mind here is that there are differences of opinion among Egyptologists over the proper chronology of dates. The identification of Amenhotep II as the reigning pharaoh in 1446 BC is according to what's known as the high chronology of ancient Egypt. This chronology was favored in the early days of Egyptology, but has largely given way to what's referred to as the low chronology among current Egyptologists. The reasons for this have to do with the accumulation of other records from around the ancient Near East over the decades of archaeological work done in the region. According to this chronological interpretation, Amenhotep II does not come to power until around 1425 BC. This leaves his predecessor, Thutmose III, as the reigning pharaoh in 1446 BC. Proponents of a 1446 BC date for the Exodus who favor Amenhotep II as the reigning pharaoh must defend this chronology in other areas of Egyptian history as well. I'm not necessarily saying that this can't be done, just that it is not as simple as making an arbitrary choice between these options. If the high chronology is proven wrong, then a 1446 BC date with Amenhotep II is not possible. Another reason that Kramer, the Armstrong Institute, and others who hold a like position favor Amenhotep II is that it is well documented that his firstborn son did not inherit the throne from him.
The successor of Amenhotep II is his son, Thutmose IV, who is not his firstborn son. His firstborn son died mysteriously, we know from the Egyptian record.
Thutmose IV wasn't the firstborn.
Okay.
He wasn't the designated heir to the throne. With pairing it, as we have done with the rest of with these other pharaohs, pairing it with the biblical account, what do we see of this successive individual to the Exodus Pharaoh? That he wasn't a firstborn.
Right.
That the Pharaoh of the Exodus, his firstborn died during the 10th plague.
Thutmose IV was not the next man in line for the throne until something happened to Amenhotep II's firstborn. What that something was, we don't know. It's reasonable to assume, though, that his son died prematurely. This would accord well with the Bible's testimony of the death of Pharaoh's firstborn during the 10th plague. The issue here, though, is that many pharaohs lost their firstborn son, including others from the 18th and 19th dynasties. Premature death was very common in the ancient world. If this is all we have to go on, then it opens up candidacy to a number of kings as the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Further, it may very well be that we do not have a full and complete record of every pharaonic family. Egyptian records from this time period are roughly 3,400 years old. The majority of them have not survived down through time, and what we do have is usually fragmented and/or sourced second or third hand. Even if we do not have an explicit record of a particular pharaoh losing his firstborn, the circumstances surrounding the preservation of Egyptian records should not cause us to write off that possibility. With regards to my proposal of Thutmose IV as the Pharaoh of the Exodus, we actually do have evidence that he had other sons, who were ahead of the son who would become his ultimate successor, Amenhotep III. Quote, 3 wives have been identified for Thutmose IV. Iaret and Nefertiri-C are both represented alongside the king on a number of monuments, but Mutemuia is only shown on those of her son, Amenhotep III. He is shown in the tomb of his tutor, Hekernehe, along with a number of other siblings. Unfortunately, only the top 2 of potentially 6 figures survive, and only one of these has a name, Amenemhat. This boy is also known from the burial in his father's tomb, thus neatly confirming the paternity of the children shown in tomb TT64. Thus, even with what is preserved in Egyptian records, Thutmose IV must be considered as much of a candidate as Amenhotep II with regards to the death of his firstborn. A charge that Kramer makes in his video is that the predecessor of the Exodus Pharaoh must have reigned for more than 40 years, on the basis of Exodus chapter 2 verse 23, chapter 4 verse 19, and Acts chapter 7 verse 30.
In Exodus, it talks about the Pharaoh that reigns before the Exodus Pharaoh, and he is often referred to as the Pharaoh of the oppression. In the book of Exodus, we are told this: Pharaoh tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian. During that long period, the king of Egypt died, before the Lord had said to Moses in Midian, "Go back to Egypt." In the New Testament, in Acts chapter 7, Stephen is retelling how Moses fled to Midian. But then after 40 years had passed, he returned to Egypt. We can test this then with Amenhotep II. Did the predecessor of Amenhotep II reign for more than 40 years? Well, his predecessor was his father, Thutmose III. And Thutmose III had a reign of 54 years. He's the only pharaoh in the 18th dynasty that had a reign for more than 40 years. So Amenhotep II passes this test. Moses returns to Egypt after 40 years had passed, which means that the predecessor, as we've looked at already, of the Exodus Pharaoh needs to have reigned for more than 40 years.
This is an overstatement. All that the Bible says is that during the 40 years Moses was in Midian, the Pharaoh he fled from died, as well as all those who would have wanted to prosecute him. The Bible does not say that there was not another Pharaoh who reigned between the time of the death of the Pharaoh Moses fled from and the one he would encounter upon his return to Egypt. Thus, the length of the reign of the predecessor to the Exodus Pharaoh is irrelevant. The Bible simply does not speak with any certainty about this. In my own timeline, I have proposed that Moses fled from Egypt during the reign of Thutmose III and returned to meet Thutmose IV on the throne. If correct, this would mean that the reign of Amenhotep II would have come and gone without the Bible's mention. A final point I want to examine is Kramer's use of Manetho.
Okay, so if we're going to talk about the Pharaoh of the Exodus, then we need to talk about the historian Manetho, because he's an extra biblical source for the Exodus. Now, the writings of Manetho are lost to us, except through the quotes from later writers. And the earliest of those writers is the first century Jewish historian Josephus. This is the complete works of Josephus. And in it, Josephus wrote that one of Egypt's principal writers was Manetho, who was by birth an Egyptian. He wrote a history of his own country in the Greek tongue, out of their sacred records. Josephus says of Manetho, "I will set down his very words as if I were to bring the very man himself into a court for a witness." Okay, so what Josephus is saying here is that the AD 1st century historian Josephus is directly quoting the earlier 3rd century BC historian Manetho, who has written a history of Egypt using these much earlier Egyptian records. There's no doubt that Manetho wrote about the Israelites because he described a people whose leader was called Moses, who were captives in Egypt, but when they went out of that country, they built a city in Judea and called it Jerusalem. Then Manetho says that these people took their journey from Egypt during the reign of Amenhotep, the king of Egypt. Amenhotep is the Greek form of the Egyptian name Amenhotep. So in Josephus, we are given a quote from Manetho where he names the Pharaoh of the Exodus. This is huge. Josephus doesn't know the name Amenhotep. He only knows it because he's quoting Manetho, and Manetho knows the name Amenhotep because he has access to these early Egyptian records. So the name Amenhotep, the Pharaoh of the Exodus, is coming from these earlier records and being recorded in the history of Egypt written by Manetho in the 3rd century BC and then quoted in AD 1st century by the historian Josephus. This is an incredible source that lets us know the name of the Exodus Pharaoh.
In his full context, here is what Josephus says in regards to Manetho. Quote, "And now I will turn my discourse to one of their principal writers, whom I have a little before made use of as a witness to our antiquity. I mean Manetho. He promised to interpret Egyptian history out of their sacred writing, and premised this, that our people had come into Egypt, many 10,000s in number, and subdued its inhabitants. When he had further confessed that we went out of that country afterward, and settled in that country, which is now called Judea, and there built Jerusalem and its temple. Now thus far he has followed his ancient records. But after this, he permits himself, in order to appear to have written what rumors and reports passed abroad about the Jews, and introduces incredible narrations, as if he would have the Egyptian multitude that had the leprosy and other distempters to have been mixed with us, as he says they were, and that they were condemned to fly out of Egypt together. For he mentions Amenhotep, a fictitious king's name, though on that account he durst not set down the number of years of his reign, which he yet had accurately done as to the other kings he mentions. He then ascribes certain fabulous stories to this king, as having in a manner forgotten how he already related that the exodus of the shepherds for Jerusalem had been 518 years before, for Moses was king when they went away. Rather than being an endorsement for Amenhotep II, the reader of Josephus should take note of his skepticism towards Manetho. If anything, Josephus concludes this passage with an endorsement of a pharaoh named Thutmose. We do not know which Amenhotep or which Thutmose are being referenced here, given that multiple pharaohs had this name. This citation is simply too ambiguous to serve as a reliable witness for Amenhotep II's candidacy as the pharaoh of the Exodus. That Kramer did not point this out is again misleading. In my opinion, the biggest problem for Amenhotep II being the pharaoh of the Exodus is not one that was addressed in either video. In the wake of Amenhotep II's reign, Egypt is at the height of its imperial power and influence. This is demonstrated by the fact that Thutmose IV was able to claim Egyptian hegemony through the Levant during his reign in sealing a treaty with the kingdom of Mitanni, Egypt's chief rival at this time, and, previously, the dominant power in the Fertile Crescent. That Egypt was able to put enough pressure on Mitanni to get them to concede to this treaty is proof of the power that they had after Amenhotep II's death. If the Exodus occurred during his reign, the inevitable consequences would have been 1. A period of Egyptian military weakness, and 2. A period of Egyptian economic instability. If either or both of these circumstances were prevalent in Egypt, it is highly unlikely, if not impossible, that the Mitanni would have ever conceded to this treaty. I don't produce this video with any animosity or ill will towards Joel Kramer or the Armstrong Institute. I believe all the individuals in these videos are real brothers in Christ who are sincere in their opinions. Nonetheless, examining the evidence leads me to disagree with their conclusion that Amenhotep II was the pharaoh of the Exodus. If you are interested in the proposal for Thutmose IV as the pharaoh of the Exodus, you can watch parts 6, 8, 9, and 10 of my series on the date of the Exodus. I also recommend the book Let My People Go by Stephen Collins. You will find a link to this book in the description.